So for this video, we're going to look at graphing trig functions, and specifically we're going to start with sine and cosine. So our sine and cosine graphs, they look like waves, and they continue in the same pattern on forever. So that means our domain is going to be all real numbers for both sine and cosine. Our range is going to be based on whatever we call our amplitude, and the amplitude is just kind of the height of our wave, right? Now the amplitude is just the height of half of it. So it's how tall it is off of the x-axis. So like this is what I would consider to be my amplitude. So whatever my amplitude is how high it comes above and how high it goes below. And then we have what we call the period, which is how long it takes to do one complete cycle. So for my sine, it's going to go up, come down, and get all the way back here, and then it's going to start repeating. So that means that this section here is one complete cycle, so my period for the parent function is 360 degrees. That's how long it takes to go one time around. All right, if you notice, the sine and the cosine graphs look very, very similar. The difference is that sine goes through 0, 0, and cosine goes through 0, 1. Other than that, they are the same. All right, so make sure you remember that sine always goes through 0, 0, and cosine is going to go through whatever your amplitude is. All right, couple other things to note. Because it is only going like up into 1 and down to -1, my range for sine and cosine for the parent functions is -1 to 1. So if I wrote that in an interval notation, I'd put brackets. And then if I look at that cycle, so if I look just at the cycle for sine, I have 3 x-intercepts, and it's going to go up, go down, come back. That's important. If I look at my cosine, right, here's my starting point and my ending point, it's going to come down in the middle and then go back up. Okay, both of these have important points every fourth of the way. So for sine, I start at 0, and then I go up, there's a fourth of the way. I come down, there's a fourth of the way, that's halfway. I go down, there's 3/4 of the way, and then I'm back here. For cosine, I start up, I come to my x-intercept 1/4 of the way, I go down to the bottom halfway, I come back to the x-intercept 3/4 of the way, and then I'm back up. Okay, we're going to divide all of our periods into 4s to be able to graph our sine and cosine functions. Okay, another thing, whenever we want to find our period and our amplitude, we can get that just by looking at our equation. And just like with our other functions in our equations, we have letters that mean certain things every single time we see those graphs. So for our sine and cosine, we have y equals a times sine of b theta. Now we're going to add some more letters eventually, but right now we're just going to look at these two, a and b. That a is like our other one, it's always in the front, and it kind of sort of tells us how we stretch and compress it. So that's going to talk about our amplitude. So our amplitude for all of our trig functions is just a, whatever a is. All right, now remember, we don't consider like height to be a negative number, so we really just look at the absolute value of a. So if it was a -1/2, we would just use the 1/2. So that's going to tell us how high it comes above the x-axis and how low it goes below. And our period, we have a little formula, 2 pi over b. And the b is the one that's on the inside with theta. Now we're basically saying 2 pi, remember 2 pi radians is the same as 360 degrees. So we're taking the 360 degrees and dividing it by b. That b is telling us how much of a normal cycle it gets in that 360 degree period of our parent function. Right, so for example, if it was sine of 1/2 theta, that's saying that it gets halfway through a cycle in our normal 360. So then when we do 2 pi divided by half, it ends up becoming 4 pi, which we'll look at in a few minutes. All right, if I said cosine of 2 theta, that means it's getting through 2 complete cycles in one normal period of 360, which means it's going, down here. Right, it's going twice in that normal period, so that means that the period of this particular graph would be half, and so it would be 180 instead of 360. All right, but we'll look at that in a minute. So some questions that we'll see. For this one, I just want to find the amplitude and the period looking at my equation. So if I look for the amplitude, remember that's always the a that's out front, so in this case it's 1. So my amplitude of this graph is just 1. That means it goes up to 1 and down to -1. My period, I'm going to plug into my equation. So we've got 2 pi divided by b. So we get 2 pi divided by 1/3. Right? So if I'm doing dividing by a fraction, I multiply by the reciprocal. So 2 pi times 3/1 is 6 pi. So my period is 6 pi. Now that 6 pi is in radians. Sometimes you'll need to know degrees. So let's practice going back to degrees. So we have 6 pi times 180 over pi. All right, your pi's cancel, so we do 6 times 180, which is 1080. So I am 6 pi radians, or 1080 degrees for my period. All right, for this one I want to find it for sine of 1/2 theta. Again, my amplitude, my A value is 1, so that means I can cross out C and D. Right, then I'm going to do 2 pi divided by 1/2. Right, so that becomes 2 pi times 2, which is 4 pi. All right, but again, my answers are in degrees, so we need to switch to degrees. All right, cross those out, so we get 180 times 4, which is 720. All right, for the next one, we want to actually graph this function. All right, so I want to graph sine of 3q, and that's just another variable. That's the same as sine of 3 theta. All right, so I'm going to use my amplitude and my period and what I know about sine. To start with, I know sine's going to go through 0, 0. So normally when we graph it, it goes like this, right? Remember, these are all of our fourths. All right, so for first, I'm going to find my amplitude, which is 1. I'm going to go on my graph. And I know my highest point is going to be at 1, and my lowest is going to be at -1, and I'm going to start at 0, 0. Then I need to find my period, so we do 2 pi divided by 3, which I can't simplify that, so that means that when I go into fourths, this is going to be 2 pi over 3. Now I'm going to cut that in half. So I know that half of 2 pi over 3 is 1 pi over 3, so that means pi over 3 is going to go in the middle. And I'm going to cut that in half again to find the first important point. So pi over 3 divided by 2 is the same as pi over 3 times 1/2, which is pi over 6. So if 1/4 is pi over 6, I have 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, which simplifies to pi over 2. So all I did was find my fourths, and now I'm going to put in my pattern. So I've got 0, 0, then it goes up, comes back to 0, goes down, and back to 0. And then I'm just going to connect and draw my curve. And there's my sine graph. All right, now I want to graph 1/2 cosine theta. So for this one, now my amplitude is 1/2. So I'm going to go on my graph. Still going to go up and down, but now it's going to be 1/2 instead of 1. So I have 1/2 and -1/2, and for cosine, we start up top. Sine goes through the origin, cosine starts up top. So now I'm going to start up here, and I'm going to say my, because there's no b value, my period's still 2 pi, or 360. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. This is 2 pi. This is pi. Pi over 2. 3 pi over 2. All right, and then for cosine, we start up top, come to 0, go down to the bottom, come to 0, back up at the top. And we're just going to draw our wave in. All right, now I've got sine of 2q, or sine of 2 theta. So my amplitude is 1, so I can cross out the c down here, or b, whatever this bottom one is, because my amplitude has to be from 1 to -1. All right, then it's sine, so I know it's got to go through 0, 0, which all these do. And then I just got to find my period. So if I do 2 pi divided by 2, that means my period is pi or 180 degrees. All right, so that means it does one complete cycle in 180 degrees. So this one's out because there's 180. Here's 180, that one's out. Here's 180, and there's my full cycle. And then for our last one, we've got 3 cosine 2 theta, or 2q. So my amplitude's 3, so I can cross this one out, and this one out, and this one out, so that narrows it down for us. But if I look at my period again, we do 2 pi divided by 2, which is pi, or 180 degrees. So again, if I look here, here's my 180, and there's my complete cycle. So that one's got to be A.